Our speaker for today is Katherine Ellena, is Vice President of Programs for the International Foundation for I keep saying electrical, but it is electoral systems. The International Foundation for Electoral Systems is a global, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization based in Arlington, Virginia. Katherine provides strategic and operational leadership to the Foundation's programs worldwide. Ellena first joined the International Foundation for Electoral Systems in 2004, working as a legal fellow for the Foundation's programs in India. Following a stint with the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Ellena rejoined the Foundation in order to manage its field programs in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ellena has worked with government ministries, election boards, oversight bodies, and anti-corruption commissions in over 25 countries over the past 18 years. In 2021, not that long ago, Katherine Ellena helped launch the Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust. The trust is an initiative of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. It is focused on anti-corruption initiatives that address the global democratic deficit. Ellena is a special advisor to the American Bar Association. She holds a bachelor's degree in law and philosophy from the University of Canterbury and a master's degree in law with honors from the same university. Katherine Ellena also has a diploma in international development from the London School of Economics. A year ago, in 2021, President Biden held 2 summits for democracy. We asked Katherine Ellena to speak on the de-democratization and what the U.S. should do about it. Now let us welcome Katherine Ellena. Good to have you.
Thank you so much, Don. Thank you to the library for inviting me to do this presentation. I will say, having just been online for the last 5 minutes, it feels like I am among old friends already. And I will say this is the second time I've actually been asked to present by a library or a library-related association. I spoke with the American Library Association a couple of years ago, and prior to that I hadn't focused much on the role of libraries in fostering this kind of dialogue, and particularly the role they play in democracy. So again, I just very much admire what you're doing. I apologize to anyone who joined expecting a discussion on electrical systems. I know nothing about that. And my topic today is a very heavy one in comparison to some of the other topics that were just listed in the coming weeks. So I feel like we should have wine and cheese while we're talking about this topic as well. But regardless, I'm very happy to be here with you and to share some thoughts and experience from IFAS. So I will just quickly share my screen. And if someone can just let me know that you can see that. Yes,
yes.
Perfect. Excellent.
It's perfect. It's perfect.
Great. So the topic today, as Don said, is de-democratization around the world and what to do about it. Now, I have no illusions that I can to answer that question in an hour or so, but I would love to just share some thoughts based on IFAS's experience dealing with de-democratization, and particularly as it pertains to the electoral work that they do. And maybe just to add to the introduction that Don said, IFAS has been around 35 years now, and we've worked in over 150 countries. Probably most of the elections that you hear about in the news, IFAS is likely to be there or involved in some way, particularly those in developing countries. But certainly our work over time has transitioned from core electoral administration work in the early 90s through to much more expansive democracy work related to inclusion, disinformation, corruption, and different elements that sort of challenge elections and democracy now. So let me make sure I can switch. There we go. So just looking at trends where we are right now, the Varieties of Democracy is an institute outside the, in the University of Gothenburg. And they do very interesting studies each year about trends around democracy. Their report looking at 2022 said that the level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in 21 is now down to 1989 levels. That essentially means that the last 30 years of democratic advances are now eradicated, is what they said in their report. They also said dictatorships are on the rise and harboring 70% of the world population, 5.4 billion people. And the most common governing system now is electoral autocracy. So these trends and these numbers are staggering. When you think when IFAS sort of came into being, was post-Cold War, you know, working on this wave of democratization, and now we see the opposite wave, and our work has really changed because of that. So what is backsliding? How is it being defined? There was a series of research papers that USAID sponsored. You can see one of them here, 2015. This one was led by Yale. And they said backsliding is best conceived as a change in a combination of competitive electoral procedures, civil and political liberties, and accountability. And that backsliding occurs through a series of discrete changes in the rules and informal procedures that shape those elections, rights, and accountability. And the quote actually goes on to say, these changes take place over time and are separated by months or even years. So the end result is not always predetermined. Backsliding might result in democratic breakdown. For example, what we've seen in Myanmar and Tunisia, both countries where IFAS has invested heavily, or it may not result in that. But it can also occur within both democratic and authoritarian regimes. But regardless of whether that backsliding ultimately leads to some kind of regime change, it does degrade citizens' rights and essentially their engagement with the state. So this is the definition of backsliding that I think IFAS really focuses on. Now, I will say, and I think Don has heard me say this, I often like to focus on de-democratization or active autocratizing as opposed to backsliding, because I find backsliding to be a very passive term. Whereas I think a lot of what we're seeing in different countries is much more of an active process of de-democratization, the deliberate erosion of these different components that you see in this definition here. And for me, that reinforces how pressing the defense of democracy has become. And I think that in large part is replicated in the Biden administration's Summit for Democracy process, as well as several other initiatives, including designating corruption as a national security priority, because corruption and de-democratization are somewhat interlinked, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So would-be autocrats essentially use a lot of levers to de-democratize society for their own benefit. And I'm going to focus particularly on one lever, elections being what we know the best, and how elections can be protected in this de-democratizing environment. You know, and people often say elections are a necessary but not a sufficient component of democracy. And, you know, I think that's very much a truism, but I would hate to focus on these other components of democracy and forget about the necessity of elections, neglecting that kind of core component. And I will say, people ask me sometimes, why is IFAS talking about elections in Syria, in Libya, in Ukraine? There are much more pressing democratic issues of concern there. However, elections really are necessary to democracy. So if we want to see democracy or democratic resilience take root in Libya or be preserved in Ukraine, it must be focused on as one of those components of democratic resilience. So again, elections then, who cares? In the last year, there's been around 88, this is national level elections in around 56 countries. For those interested, we have a separate website, Election Guide, that tracks national elections and accurate data about those elections around the world. In the last 2 months, we've witnessed lots of contentious elections from Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Brazil, all of the Bs for some reason. Elections are obviously both a technical and a political process. So we're never going to be able to design or implement foolproof electoral systems that are not vulnerable to mistakes or misfeasance. And one thing I do say, you know, when talking in other countries as well, there's no perfect democratic formula either, but the ingredients of democracy are the important components. So the right to vote, stand for election, form political parties, speak freely, those are fundamental, but the recipe and the electoral system might be different for each country, but it's the components that need to be protected. If you have unjust elections, you can produce and feed unjust systems of power. And interestingly, across regions, the same democracy report from VDEM showed that elections are the one aspect of democracy that actually have the highest average improvement among democratizers. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. So other components such as maybe freedom of media and speech, freedom of civil society, strength of the judiciary, they are lower than elections, which have actually showed the highest average improvement. So when we talk about protecting the electoral process and the legitimacy of it, what does that mean? So the legitimacy of any election and consequently, the legitimacy of government depends on both the actual and the perceived integrity of the electoral process. And I think there's a fair amount to unpack there. Firstly, it seems simple, but if you don't have a legitimate election, you don't have legitimate government. So again, we see many autocracies holding elections to legitimize their rule. But if those elections don't have integrity and not legitimate, then the government itself doesn't have the legitimacy of an electoral democracy. And the second important thing here is that it's not just the integrity of the electoral process that we have to care about, it's people's perceptions of that integrity and their trust in not just the process, but also the result. And I think that's obviously been a challenge anywhere, including here in the US. So one thing I hear often is democracy a victim of indifference? We do see a lack of trust in most of the countries we work now related to the electoral process. Disenchantment, polarization, many challenges increasing. One question that comes to my mind is how much of this is indifference and how much of this is deliberately fueled by autocrats as a process of that de-democratization. The more you can fuel polarization or a lack of trust or confusion, the more you can undermine processes or institutions in a process of essentially retaining power. So democracy requires voters who are willing to hold elected leaders accountable. And indifference, whether it's come about naturally or it's been fueled deliberately, makes it difficult. We desperately still need elections to be the ultimate mechanism of accountability. This quote was interesting. It came in an article recently from Francis Fukuyama, who I think was sort of revisiting his end of history doctrine. saying that it still is the end of history, essentially, but liberal democracy will not make a comeback unless people are willing to struggle on its behalf. So for us, this disenchantment, this polarization, and the way it comes about is really fundamental when it comes to elections in particular. So this is an example of the challenges that we face around the world on a daily basis. It's very easy for bad actors these days to exploit weaknesses or sources of discontent with democracy. This will not be new for anyone listening in today. But in contrast, for defenders of democracy, it's a much more difficult task, protecting the entire democratic process and convincing the public that the system works for them. Managing elections has always been challenging, and I had some colleagues write an article in the Journal of Democracy recently where they said elections don't run themselves. How an election is conducted, from the registration of voters and candidates to the tallying and final certification of the results, determines whether it's a free and fair contest or a rigged and undemocratic one. As I said at the start, once upon a time when IFES was first in existence, a lot of our work was just focused on the technical aspects of how to run an election, how to register voters, how to produce election materials. But that's not enough now. We worked in a democratizing environment then. Now we work in a de-democratizing environment. So the assumptions of reform are generally absent now in the places where we work. So now we can expect restrictions on civil liberties, fake news, as you see here, corruption, cyber attacks. All of these are many deliberate components of essentially the autocrat's playbook. So what measures do we have to respond? From IFES's experience, to defend this core part of democracy, the electoral process, those institutions that are managing the electoral process need these kind of three things: to be protected from political interference, to be radically accountable where possible, and I'll explain that in a minute, and then they need resilience. In terms of protection from political interference, so regardless of the election management model chosen, and the model in the US is of course quite different from other countries, many of which have a centralized dedicated election commission. But regardless of the model, evidence quite clearly suggests that voters' judgments about an election may be impacted by how independent election officials are from other parts of government in the exercise of their election duties. So even if you have a multi-party or a government commission, the management of elections must be conducted in accordance with democratic principles and done so transparently. So routinely we see autocrats or those with autocratic tendencies looking to undermine the independence of the election management body that we're working with, whether it's through the appointment process of commissioners, restricting the funding of an election management body, or maybe manipulating the staff and the personnel of the election commission in some way. Also, we routinely see rhetoric around the independence of election managers. So once upon a time, that threat wasn't as pronounced, but nowadays election managers have to both deliver a sound election and adapt to public perceptions coming from different types of rhetoric that might be used by certain actors. So one tool to be able to help protect the body from political interference is accountability mechanisms. So there are a number of ways that the bodies that we work with or the individuals that we work with in elections can demonstrate accountability to essentially try and push back on this de-democratization influence. They can, one of the most effective ones we've seen is where election managers collaborate with other bodies. So whether it is with civil society to help bolster the public perception, maybe with journalists to help get out accurate information about the election. That collaboration tends to help shore up the election management body much more than if it were just operating kind of in a silo on its own. Even in a difficult environment, that's been key. Another option is independent observers. And again, this has been not a common observance in the United States, but independent observers, either national or international, who can issue objective reports on the soundness of voting procedures. And it was very interesting, and I'm going to forget the country now, if it was El Salvador. A few years back, the actual vendor of the election technology came out publicly and said that the technology and the results process was actually manipulated. And that was a substantial sort of claim by the vendor who was actually providing that technology to be able to come out publicly, knowing that this had gone on, to be able to transparently say that this had taken place. In the US, another mechanism we've seen, of course, is the introduction of different types of audits around the results. And then, of course, another thing we often encourage is just active engagement of the public in the electoral process and with the election management bodies. So that's accountability. Now, just before I talk about the third component around resilience, I wanted to maybe share some small positive aspects in all of this. And it helps to illustrate some of the components I just talked about in terms of protection from political interference and accountability. So the varieties of democracy, again, at the University of Gothenburg, talk about or identify the democratizers. And these are the countries that have essentially been bucking the de-democratization trend over the past 10 years and steadily democratizing. And you'll see here in this slide, these are the top 10 from 2011 to 2021 who have been making steady gains in terms of democratization, going against the tide. And you'll recall I said earlier that in these democratizers, the component that has showed the most promise or improvement is around the electoral process. So how have these countries been democratizing? And here you can see, sorry, I have to move my image out of the way. So you can see here, Armenia, just over the past 5 to 6 years, has started to make some steady progress on two planes. The blue line that you see here is the independence of the body that runs their elections. And then the second line, the red, is the capacity of the body to run their elections. And that's important because the blue line, that's about how protected the body is from political interference. How independent is it? And then the red line is how capable is it of engaging with the public and holding political parties accountable. So you can see both of those lines have started to go up and has helped keep Armenia on this trajectory of democratization. You can see some specific examples there on the left of reforms. A number of legislative reforms, particularly related to political party regulation. Similarly, incentives for meeting agenda quota, so financial incentives through political funding. And then that last one there is what we were talking about, inclusive consultation processes to build that public trust with the body and push back against narratives or rhetoric that might be pushing more towards de-democratization. The Gambia, fascinating case, because of course it had been under 20 years of severe dictatorship before it opened up in 2017, where I had the privilege of visiting. So you can see a real spike there where both the autonomy and the capacity of the Electoral Commission shot right up. And you'll see here several of the steps that they took: improving the quality of the voter register, so actually enfranchising people; civic education, reaching out, explaining the electoral process; and lowering electoral violence. And so you can see that trajectory there, focused on the Election Commission. Malawi, so in contrast here, this wasn't this kind of big shooting up and down. Here it's slightly more up and down steady. Malawi has had active participation of civil society in the electoral process with the electoral management body. They've tried to improve the accuracy of the electoral process itself. Some of you will know Malawi's presidential elections and parliamentary elections were annulled by their Supreme Court in 2020. And so they had to go through a lot of soul searching and improving their electoral process. So they've optimized the results management process, and there's a lot more transparency now. And you can see the trends starting to shift there for Malawi. And then just lastly, these ones are interesting because they were included in the list of democratizers: Georgia, the Republic of Georgia, and Tunisia, for similar reasons in terms of making improvements in their electoral process. But you can see just in recent times, very recent times, both countries have just experienced that setback. And similar to what we talked about in Tunisia, we've seen a dramatic setback. Essentially, the president doing a self-coup, taking over the rule of law, and it's shifted almost overnight there. Whereas in Georgia, they had made a lot of improvement, and that's a country where IFAS has worked for many, many years to support the Electoral Commission. But in the last couple of years, there has been significant political polarization there, and you can see the politicization of public institutions. So the attacks have really ramped up on the institutions that are protecting democracy, including the Electoral Commission. So finally, I just want to turn to this component of resilience, because I think for me, this is the most fundamental. And what does it mean? Again, the University of Gothenburg have actually got a definition for democratic resilience. They call it the persistence of democratic institutions and practices. The persistence of democratic institutions and practices. And it sounds simple, but obviously it's not. And when it comes to elections here, we're talking about the institutions involved in delivering and protecting elections. And here I'm talking not just about the election officials who run the elections, but also, for example, the judiciary, who increasingly are hearing cases related to the electoral process, or alleging fraud or manipulation of the electoral process. So the persistence of those institutions are fundamental to avoid de-democratization. And then so are the persistence of democratic practices. So of course, one clear practice is just that of running elections. But other practices in terms of freedom of speech, for example, the ability to gather and assemble. The persistence of those and how we protect them are important. Now, there are, in my view, the biggest two threats to that democratic resilience are corruption and disinformation. And I'm going to focus briefly on corruption, primarily because it's more of my expertise. I have fabulous colleagues working on disinformation if you ever want to dive further into that topic. But for me, these two tools or levers are the ones that de-democratizers use the most to achieve a grip over institutions, practices in their country, and ultimately to preserve power. So in terms of corruption, as I said earlier, it thrives on unjust systems of power and what I like to call influence markets. And for me, a key threat to elections when it comes to corruption is the misuse of state resources for political gain, and then illicit or opaque funding and spending in the electoral process. And what I mean by the misuse of state resources, this is things like the misuse of public media to amplify government propaganda, for example, the misuse of buildings, vehicles, state funds to try and influence voters towards a certain position. And part of why it's so problematic is it gives those in power the strength of incumbency, because they have access to these resources and they leverage them in a way to strengthen that incumbency. So there's a very deep corruption that takes place or takes root in the electoral process and then permeates through governance beyond elections. And then I love this quote from Colombia, and Gomez was the head of the Guatemala Anti-Impunity Commission. Illicit electoral financing is not only the original sin of democracy, but it undermines the rule of law, generates inequity in the electoral process, and distorts the popular will. And he calls it the original sin of democracy because he talks about illicit electoral financing as connecting corrupt actors in the public and private sector together in the election, and then those corrupt relationships are perpetuated again beyond elections in the governance process through these influence markets. And I talk about both funding and spending deliberately in elections, because it matters, I think, not just where the money comes from, but how it is used. And ultimately, both of those aspects have to do with influence. So in terms of where the money comes from, I don't want foreign corrupt actors, for example, to be influencing the representative that I might be voting for. So corrupt funds coming from overseas, potentially into representatives, that has a certain types of influence. In terms of where the money goes, I certainly don't want opaque or illicit funding generating inauthentic online content, which then again influences me and other voters. And we've certainly seen an explosion in inauthentic online content as very much a mechanism of autocrats in their own countries, but then of course in other countries, including here in the US. So a common element across all corrupt regimes that we see and work in an autocratizing regime is that special interests are essentially enriched at the public expense. And again, as I've said, I think this is the third time, it starts in the electoral process, because that's where power and influence comes from. And for me, for IFAS, this matters for kind of two key reasons. Almost every country's have elections, as I said at the start. So even autocrats have elections to legitimize their rule. So it's a key lever of potential de-democratization, but for us also a key lever of potential democratization if we can protect and advance elections effectively. And then again, the second reason, elections still remain the ultimate measure of accountability. So they still are a fundamental way that we can hold corrupt actors to account. So just lastly, how can we fortify or inoculate democratic systems, particularly to help prevent illicit funds from eroding these systems? And here again, I'm speaking specifically around corruption, illicit financing in elections, and the specific way that is used in de-democratization. First, just talking about it more. I think when I first started working on campaign political financing 35 years ago, it was a very niche, probably quite boring topic, whereas now it is much more on the forefront of the public consciousness, but still I think it needs to be talked about a lot more, particularly the nuances and the new challenges facing us. As part of it, we need to encourage new generations, I think, not to become apathetic, but empower them to act on this particular issue. And we need to, I think, continue to focus on democracy as having both normative and functional value. So democracy has to deliver for citizens, but it also must be valued for what it intrinsically protects, which of course is freedom and individual rights. Second, we need action at both the national and the international level. And when I say national, I'm talking about all of the countries essentially that we work in. We need more transparency to eradicate the influence of dark money, including as it pertains to funding online political advertising. More sophisticated sanctioning power to prevent dirty money leaking into politics, and certainly sanctioning powers in the US have sort of skyrocketed again after the Ukraine war and in other countries. We need strengthened regulatory and enforcement regimes around foreign funding in elections. And then, interestingly, I think we need attention to new areas such as cryptocurrency. We're working in El Salvador, which has introduced cryptocurrency as national currency. And that is bringing its own new challenges around transparency in political funding. Third, strong independent institutions. I already touched on this. I will say judges are increasingly on the front lines of democracy and need to be protected, but also other government institutions, for example, audit agencies, including those that audit political financing reports. Fourth, civil society and media. I think we need brave journalists more than we did ever before, raising these types of issues, trying to counteract the narratives and the polarization we see, and uncovering corruption. And then finally, we do have to consider transnational corruption. And this is actually a big theme of the Biden administration's Summit for Democracy and the administration's national anti-corruption strategy. So for us, I think we're all aware of how transnational corruption, we're aware of it when it comes to trafficking, looting state resources, money laundering. This all weakens democracy and society. What IFAS has been focused on is not just the extractive behavior. So the behavior when an autocrat is stealing money for personal or political gain, but the investment behavior. Again, where is that dirty, illicit money going? Is it going into corrupting other democracies? And this is where we need new approaches. We need new norms around foreign funding in elections. And I will tell you, many legal frameworks around the world are silent about foreign funding in elections. We need new approaches to online political advertising, another area where we're seeing an explosion of corrupt or illicit behavior. And then we need just new forms of monitoring to be able to understand where the funds are coming from and where they're going. So once we can diagnose the problem, we can then start to address the issues based on the data. So I'm conscious I have taken a lot of time and thrown a lot at you, but I'm excited for questions, hopefully not too difficult, not focused on electrical issues. But again, thank you for the opportunity and look forward to discussion.
Thank you, Katherine. Yes, you have thrown lots of things at us. And a lot of ideas, of course, have not only come from you and your presentation, but you're leaving us with a number of things to think about. When you think about the importance of journalists, which you meant to mention a couple of times, and the importance of protection, physical protection for people who are trying to move forward, and you think, of course, of a poor husband living at home and then being hit on the head because of his marriage. And all of these things are amazingly important to protecting the democracies that we have. At the same time as you talked, I was kind of making a checklist for the United States as we went along. And many of those issues that you raised are certainly close to home here. And that is a problem. I would like to just mention briefly, if I may, I see you, Tyler. I mentioned briefly, my own experience has been with Albania, which, as you know, during the 30s and the Second World War, and then into the after-war period, was a communist state with a dictator called Enver Hoxha. And when he died in the mid-1980s, he had a vice president who became the next dictator. But the people rose up in Albania because they saw around them freedom and democracies. And they have been struggling now for the last 30 years to get some form of democracy. And through that, they do have a parliament of 140 members. And the problem that remains is what you have talked about, corruption. That both the parties in power and the party that's supposed to be the opposition are so corrupt that the people are left with no choice, really, but are still given the opportunity to vote. So that's a long kind of introduction to what I might call, instead of backsliding, forward sliding on the part of the populace. And I wonder if you could comment on how many forward sliders are still working on behalf of democratization as compared to the number that are going the other way that you've explained so clearly.
Thank you, Don. Great question and great example of a tough country where we also operate. And across the Balkans, in fact, is a really challenging place. I mean, you saw the data from varieties of democracy, very depressing data about the volume of countries that are backsliding and just the small number of democratizers or forward sliding. And I will say that's one way to look at the data. In reality, on the ground, I always find in our programs that there are pockets of democratization and pockets, or maybe sometimes larger pockets, of backsliding or de-democratization happening at the same time. And particularly when I'm thinking about some of our programs in Western Balkans in particular, one thing you have to think about is just how long democratic consolidation takes. Think about the US experiment, for example, and we often want to see these countries who have come out of a dictatorship and emerging into democracy be graduated in democracy after 5-10 years. You've succeeded. Congratulations. First of all, that's not how democracy works. I think it requires a long time of consolidation. But there's also other challenges in that region. And, one you mentioned, of course, is communism. And there's a lot of social norms and structures that exist in some of these post-Soviet or post-communist countries that take a long time to sort of dismantle, which I think is something that's important to remember. I think you've talked about revolutions, and you've seen a number of these color revolutions in that region. That is definitely one way, obviously, to change towards democracy quite dramatically. But we have seen, if there is not very quick progress immediately after a revolution like that you can quickly slide backwards. And I actually think Ukraine prior to the war is a very good example of where those people who sort of pushed for that revolution then went into government, judiciary, civil society, media with the same incentives of pushing Ukraine towards democracy. And it was a good example of rapid change after a revolution. Now, if you don't have the same kind of revolution, and I think here of North Macedonia, who have had regime change, but not quite in the same way, there's just a lot of residual institutional capture, state capture. And it's a good example of a country with those pockets. So I know of the Anti-Corruption Commission, for example, civil society groups who have these champions who are starting to change social norms. They are putting in place digital transformation to encourage transparency in procurement, for example. But it doesn't suddenly make the country a democratizer. It's going to take a critical mass of those dots kind of to connect together to really push that forward sliding, as you call it. And again, some of that's just time. But I do think it's really important not to just look at a country as a forward slider, a backslider, but try and identify the bright points within a country that can be leveraged, including, I would say, perhaps in the US.
Yeah. Just to explain to the audience, we have today two other members of our search committee for speakers, and Tyler Beebe and Peter Watson. And they are going to ask a question or two, I'm sure, given their opportunities. And then we will open the Q&A to your questions out there in our audience. So Tyler, you were raising your hand.
I was indeed. Thank you, Don. Yeah, Katherine, I'm just curious about the mechanics of how IFAS works in foreign countries when you're dealing with it, particularly difficult small countries, I suppose, like Malawi or Gambia or El Salvador or so forth. Do you have embedded personnel which in fact go and tap different internal resources to discern whether in fact corruption is improving or getting worse, or whether the electrical system is becoming less dramatic? How do you, or democratic, I'm sorry, how do you make it come to the conclusion that in fact things are changing, and how do you kind of measure it all? Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. And I think sort of in answering it in two parts. One, the mechanics of how we operate in some of these countries, and then two, the kind of how do you measure the change, which I think is the harder part, although they're both hard. We work in different ways depending on the environment. Obviously, when we're in a country that is one of those forward sliders, as Don said, it's very easy for us to go in with a country office, with a presence. You know, as Don said at the start, we are known to be non-partisan, non-profit, international, known for our sort of non-partisan technical assistance. So we can go in and work directly with institutions, and they know that we will provide them advice and options without sort of telling them what to do. And we'll provide technical expertise to try and help push some of those technical solutions. Now, in countries where it is more challenging, where there's more pushback against perceived foreign interference, or when there's very closed environments, we work in different ways. Sometimes we are not present in the country at all. We are working through supportive local bodies on the ground, particularly civil society organizations. Occasionally, for example, we'll be working with members of the diaspora or opposition, let's say with Venezuela or Myanmar, and outside of the country. So we have to adapt quite quickly, as we did in Myanmar, depending on the situation. As for measuring, and I think there's measuring two different things. I think one is measuring public perceptions and how people are seeing that things are changing. That can be tough. I think traditionally trying to do different types of surveys, interviews, again, usually through locals on the ground, and trying to do not just public surveys, but specific sectoral surveys. So for example, in North Macedonia, we're interested in learning what are the social norms and perceptions within the public sector, so the public administration, not just the public perceptions, but those bureaucrats themselves, what are their perceptions? When it comes to measuring progress, that's a much more difficult thing that I don't think a lot of people have quite tackled yet. You saw some of the data from VDEM. We do have a number of assessments that we use to measure progress over time. For example, we have what's called the electoral integrity assessment, and that breaks apart the electoral process into 18 different categories, and we can score kind of the residual vulnerabilities to manipulation on different dimensions and look at them over time. So for example, we can measure improvements or areas where it's worsened with respect to political party behavior, media, the actual election administration, the situation around political financing, the voter register. So we can measure over time improvements in those areas. But again, those improvements can shift between those categories. So you can see improvement in one area and a backsliding in another, which is just, it's an unfortunate and challenging part of our work. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Yeah, just to follow on very quickly, I'm sure that some countries are tougher to deal with than others. For example, have you made any inroads in Russia in terms of getting them to kind of see the light? Obviously, the obstruction there is huge, but how do you deal with Moscow, if you can?
That is a big question. I mean, we do not work on Russia specifically, but we work on the ramifications of Russia, I would say, across the region and world. Although I think there are programs in recent times that are looking to try and push information into Russia through increasingly creative means, because in Russia, of course, Facebook, Twitter, a lot of where citizens might get like fact-based information, for example, about the Ukraine war, are all shut down. So I think organizations are looking at new ways, for example, through dating apps, to share factual information to try and counteract that narrative. I think the other important thing, and this is not something that IFAS does as much of, is sanctions. I think until there are significant sanctions on Russian elites, you're not going to get that fracturing around the Putin regime to allow any kind of erosion there. So I think there's different levers from the outside to deal with Russia. Now, the one thing I will say is, I think, and I can't put this down to just IFAS's work, but we've been in Ukraine again 10, 15 years and doing very substantial work on elections, democracy, and anti-corruption. And I think what Ukraine has achieved was a threat to Russia. So again, I would say our work in Ukraine, of course, is not directly focused on Russia, but I do think it's an example where you can see democratization trends start to put pressure on autocratic regimes from the outside.
Yeah.
Peter, how about
Thank
you? Got a question that?
Sure. Katherine, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. And I think you're doing just what you suggested needed to be done to get us to think and talk about these issues. I have a couple of questions, but let me start with one which is focused on the local country level, I guess. And that is, I noticed from your website that y'all are doing research and focusing on the role of youth. And I'm wondering if anyone has made the connection or tried to develop programs which link civic education, national service for young people, and changing the culture to curb corruption and encourage electoral participation.
I'm glad you raised that question. So yes, I don't think we have done research specifically on the connection of those three pieces, but civic education has become, it was again once a niche sort of topic for us, central to what we're doing. And particularly, we've just been talking about these post-Soviet regimes where you don't have the types of interactive analytical education that you'd have in other emerging democracies. Civic education focused on the core principles of democracy, and then, like you said, connecting it to national service. So I'll give an example. In Georgia and in Ukraine, we have developed a civic education program with the ministries of education, and then that's been spread throughout the universities in both those countries. And then as part of that programming, students have to do kind of like a capstone project around democracy, but then they will often do an internship within a specific institution. So in Ukraine, for example, we have several interns will go into the Electoral Commission. They will go into the National Agency for the Prevention of Corruption. So it's not just the education they're receiving, it's then trying to put it into practice, at least through this initial type of national service. So and we've really seen the benefits of that. But the research that you're talking about, I think is fascinating, and more should be done, but it's become a core focus for us. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, because that's the future, that's the long-term inoculation, I think, against backsliding is the youth.
If I could follow up with a question that comes back to your points about transnational focus. I've looked back at the OECD conventions and the work that's been done by Treasury Department and others focusing on bribery prevention, tax crimes, funds flows, that kind of thing. And some of the messages and the programs going back 10 years or more echo exactly what you were talking about today. How effective do you think those efforts by the group of 20 and Europeans in the US and others are being?
So I will say that the US, and this is a bright spot, the US has made real progress even in the last few years on some of these transnational issues. And I think, again, the war in Ukraine elevated the focus. I was at an event the other day on corruption with the Carnegie Foundation, and there was an activist there from Russia. She was actually with Navalny's foundation, and she was saying the only solution is you must sanction the elites. You must ensure that there becomes a crack in the elites in Russia. We need more sanctions. Stop tolerating corruption. There must be zero tolerance. And she's giving this plea, of course, to the US, but equally, I think, to the UK and other countries where a lot of the corrupt funding is being siphoned, but particularly in the legislative space in the United States. Even just the development of the Magnitsky sanction regime, and then taking that as from being focused on Russia to being focused globally. New mechanisms around transparency and beneficial ownership, a new focus on the enablers of corruption. So these are, for example, the lawyers, the accountants, the realtors who enable the money laundering through the US. Significant advances in comparison to other countries, including my own in New Zealand in this area. So I think, your comment, if there's been this rhetoric for 10 years, I think is true. But I would say even in the last 12 to 18 months, we've actually made significant progress in the US. And I'm only hoping that will continue, because it has ripple effects across the globe and on this transnational corruption issue.
One of the questions that I've asked myself over the years and still am, and that has to do with the American experience and its revolution, which was a revolutionary war, etc. And you look at Iran and you think to yourself, I do, what if we were to arm the citizens of Iran to have an equal power, as it were, against the others that are there. And is there a case that can ever be made for arming a country such as Iran, the people of Iran, to get back their democracy?
Well, you are asking a big question well outside my expertise, Don. But in response, we're certainly arming the people of Ukraine right now, of course, but then being able to arm the people of Ukraine is different from getting arms into a country, like Iran. And then, of course, you've got the nuclear dimension to that as well. So there is a lot of thorny issues there. But I will say the protests that are going on in that country, just as the sort of green revolution earlier, are very, very inspiring, but very, very difficult context there. I'm not even going to attempt to solve that one.
I can understand.
Although I would love to.
Tyler,
Catherine,
another question.
Another seemingly impossible question or issue to solve has been the endless misappropriation of foreign aid, diversion of foreign aid by countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, and so forth. How can this be moderated or stopped or controlled? It just seems to go on and on and on. And I imagine we as one of many, many donors internationally, make an effort to make sure the funds reach the intended recipients, but it doesn't seem to work that well. Any thoughts on that?
Gosh, I do have thoughts. These are getting more to be personal thoughts than necessarily related to my position with IFAS. But, Afghanistan is a heartbreak for me. I spent 10 years working on Afghanistan, have very, very dear Afghan colleagues, some of whom are still stuck or stuck in a sort of third country at the moment. You're absolutely right. The corruption that took place, the funneling of the funds is just, there's reports that the special investigator for Afghanistan reconstruction, highly recommend the reports. They are so well researched, talking about what went on there. One challenge, and again, this is my personal opinion, I think the US, they'll often have these the 3 Ds of priorities: defense, diplomacy, and development. And I think sometimes we have a challenge in a country like Afghanistan, where those 3 Ds may not be all perfectly in alignment or coordinated, or even sometimes maybe clash with each other. So the funds that may be going for defense versus the funds for diplomacy and what the diplomatic priorities might be versus those for development, I think there are real weaknesses potentially there in a place like Afghanistan, and we need to look a lot more closely as to this interagency responsibility and cohesive priorities in a particular country. And then again, as you said, I think we've learned, well, I'd like to say we've learned lessons from Afghanistan and how to track and take care of the funds. I think it was much better in some sectors than others. I will tell you, our programs in Afghanistan, I think, were audited probably 8 times over. But I don't know if I can say the same about how some direct agency funding was going to direct agencies in Afghanistan as an example. Yeah, it's another thorny issue I have no solutions for.
I'm going to ask Joan to come back in a moment, but I'm going to give Peter a chance to ask the last question and show our appreciation as well for Katherine coming to talk to us, being who she is, and attempting to go outside her immediate domain and answer some of our questions. So Peter, if you got a last question for us.
Yes, I'd like to ask how you see the role of the groups like Transparency International and Freedom House, which have been trying to monitor and speak up on these democratic practices and frameworks for speech, freedom of assembly, media. Are they getting the word out well enough?
Yeah, really great question. I think they are fundamental. We work very closely with TI and Freedom House and a number of others. As I said, I think journalists have become even more fundamental, but in more need of protection. Some of the investigative reporting coming out lately, I just think is fascinating and so important, and really it can lead to regime change and really lead to change. So the monitoring, the reporting going on is really, really important. At the same time, it can't be the only, and actually just to finish answering your question, I don't think it's as effective in places like Russia, North Korea, Iran. That's a different nut to crack. And that's why we have to get more creative about how citizens can actually receive fact-based information to try and change the thinking around the populace. The one other thing I'll say is, at the same time as monitoring, reporting on, raising awareness of corruption, you need civil society groups working directly with government bodies or independent institutions that are willing to engage and helping them so they are not isolated. It's like that example I gave earlier. If you've got an election commission or an anti-corruption body that is reform-minded, if you can connect it with a civil society organization that's willing to help strengthen it, willing to help disseminate information to networks, that's incredibly valuable. And sometimes that civil society that organization can't be both. They can't be both a kind of monitoring body and a technical assistance body, right? They need to stay more under the radar. So I think both of those components for democratic resilience are really important.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. Thank you for being with us. And I hand you to Joan, who's going to close us down. Thank you again.
Oh, I'm saying, thank you. I had an idea of how complicated this all was, but you broke it down into its component parts, and I thank you for that, as does everybody who attended and will attend. So thank you again for that, and thank you, Don and Peter and Tyler, for helping us out and helping everybody here has a wonderful Thanksgiving. And please go to the library's website, which is chappaqua.library.org, to see all the programs that we're hosting at the library or at the Chappaqua Performing Arts Center or online. So again, thank you, Ellena. We really appreciate you coming here, and thank everyone for attending. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Katherine.
Thank you.